Tay-Sachs and sickle cell, different cultures, different responses to genetic testing. That was the subject of a presentation in Kansas City, November 2nd, 2009, by Professor Keith Wailoo of Rutgers University. Professor Wailoo, please provide an overview of the presentation that you gave this morning.
Well, I talked about the results of research I'd done for two books. One is entitled Dying in the City of the Blues, Sickle Cell Anemia and the Politics of Race and Health. And another, a more recent book, was a comparative study of the way in which three genetic diseases, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs, and sickle cell disease, have evolved in American society over the last 50 years or so. It's called the troubled dream of genetic medicine. And what I talked about is the fact that the term genetic disease, which we apply widely to many different kinds of illnesses, it really doesn't do justice to the complexity of each. Sickle cell disease, of course, has long been associated with African Americans. Tay-Sachs disease has long been associated with Ashkenazi Jews, although it has pockets of prevalence among French Canadians in the New Hampshire area, and it has associations with Louisiana Cajuns as well. And of course, cystic fibrosis, which for much of its early history was thought of as a pan-ethnic disease, since the 1980s has been thought of as the single leading lethal genetic disorder of Caucasian Americans. And so what my talk was about is to sort of look at the way in which ideas about ethnicity become involved in how we think about these diseases. There's a kind of a selectivity in terms of how we label a disease as a Jewish genetic disease, as an African American disease, as a white disease. And really my talk was looking very closely at how that selective thinking works in each of these instances.
Sounds like there's a balancing act that's almost required because of the sensitivity that's associated with this, the cultural competence, and then the interest of the individuals and the communities involved.
Well, that's true. I think the balancing act is a real one, as in for many of the groups of people affected, for instance, African Americans in the 1960s, paying attention to sickle cell disease became part of a broader goal of drawing attention to African American pain and suffering that had long gone ignored. And so what I talked about is the way in which the rising profile of the disease in the 1960s can't be understood apart from the currents political and cultural of the 1960s. The idea being that the rising profile on sickle cell disease was part of the rising profile of paying attention to the black condition. And part of what I talk about is how, in the wake of this new way of thinking about recognition as filtered through the lens of disease, in the wake of that, you have increasing recognition for Tay-Sachs and for cystic fibrosis as a white disease, following along those paths in the 1970s into the 1980s. So what I do is sort of point out that, genetics and science and medicine alone doesn't explain how we think about disease. Culture and politics does as well.
Now, it's part of that labeling it in some way racial or ethnically, and because we do that, it doesn't do any one of those considerations justice?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I mean, it really depends on labels. Can be very fruitful and very helpful, but they can also be counterproductive. And the history of these three diseases gives much to consider, and many different, let me put it this way, the history of these diseases kind of give examples of how labeling works effectively and how it works ineffectively. One of the things I talked about, for instance, was because of the close association between Ashkenazi Jews and Tay-Sachs, in the 1980s, a rabbi in Brooklyn named Joseph Eckstein was able to create a new method of testing adolescents for Tay-Sachs carrier status and creating a program of, I don't want to say arranged marriages, but involving because the rabbi was involved in the creation of marital unions, was able to basically convince particular families not to have their children marry one another. As a result of this kind of innovation, which is called the Doria Shirim, over the next generation, you've seen a dramatic drop in the rate of Tay-Sachs disease in the Ashkenazi Jewish community across America, starting in Brooklyn and as the Doria Shirim moved elsewhere. So that's a good example of how a group claiming connection to a disease and then working in a way that's consistent with its community and values against the disease could be very successful. On the other hand, I talked about the fact that another disease, cystic fibrosis, which also has somewhat high prevalence in the Ashkenazi Jewish community when the Dor Yesharim sought to expand testing for CF and for Gaucher's disease, diseases that aren't as uniformly fatal in the early years as Tay-Sachs. This caused quite a bit of controversy. The difference being not the question of whether the disease is Jewish or not. The difference being that one was a disease that's associated with early childhood mortality, unquestionably, and the others are diseases for which there are treatments, for which people could live long lives, and in the case of Gaucher's, could live a full and complete life without ever knowing one had Gaucher's, and it would never matter. So the idea of preventing children with Gaucher's disease from being born carried very different implications.
Do we ever run into a situation, though, where in our attempts to address these, we have some unintended consequences?
Well, I mean, I think the history of genetics and genetic medicine and disease is full of unintended consequences, some of which are connect with issues of race and culture, some of which connect with just the unintended consequences inherent in medicine. So one of the things I talked about is the rise of antibacterial medicine, the rise of penicillin, and new ways of treating the infections that often killed children with cystic fibrosis in the 1940s and 1950s. In the wake of the development of antibacterial medicine, these children were able to survive potentially life-threatening lung infections. However, because of antibacterial resistance, they now live with a new strain of Pseudomonas aeruginosa and other kinds of infections that are only explainable because of how widespread antibacterials have been used. So there's the history of medicine is filled with these examples of innovations in therapy or innovations in prevention which work, but then they create new problems in their wake. And one of the things that I try to do as a historian is to study that ongoing dynamic between innovation and the transformation of disease.
Now, you and your colleagues are very good at prompting questions rather than sometimes providing answers.
That's right.
And so you asked a question during a discussion period today: when is a Jewish genetic disease not a Jewish genetic disease?
And I think the question itself is really revealing of the complexities surrounding how we think about disease. I asked that question because, as I said, there's a high prevalence of Tay-Sachs in the Louisiana Cajun community. Unquestionably, the way we think about Tay-Sachs is as a Jewish genetic disease. One of the problems that I think that one of the benefits of that association is clear, that a community claims ownership of a disorder and acts against it in a concerted way. One of the downsides of that, of course, is that other groups of people for whom this disease might also have a high prevalence don't claim it as their own because they see it as, well, that's a Jewish genetic disease. And I think that it's that ambiguity that I try to explore. A good example, again, is cystic fibrosis. Ashkenazi Jews are correct in seeing that this disease is associated with their community, but the broader world in the US and across the globe tends not to think about it that way. I remember a couple years ago I was talking to a physician from France, and he thought it was stunning that in the US CF was thought of as a Caucasian disease. And he says, because everybody in France knows that it's from the Brittany region of France, right? So the idea is that every culture, every context has its way of thinking about what a disease is and what it means about ethnic or cultural identity. And we ought to take it seriously, but at the same time, we ought to also understand the ambiguities surrounding those labels. Even if they're fruitful labels, they often can lead us astray in our thinking about who suffers and why.
Professor Wailoo's books can be found on Amazon.com. His presentation during the conference in Kansas City, November 2nd, can be found on practicalbioethics.org. Professor Keith Wailoo, thank you for your time.
Thank you.